Hello, and welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles, which are the lectures associated with the 695th Lord Mayor of London. This series is all about connections in and around the square mile, what the current Lord Mayor, Michael Magnelli, calls the world's coffee house, and how those connections might help us tackle future global challenges. So today's lecture is called Fish, Food and Finance, a Journey Through London, and is presented by the Marine Stewardship Council, who have offices on Snow Hill, just next to Holborn Viaduct in the city. My name is Richard Harvey. I'll be convening this session and moderating the Q&A. If you're curious about such things, I'm a professor of computer science at the University of East Anglia, but I'm a former Gresham College professor, hence the connection with the City of London. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping from me. This is the agenda for today, which is delightfully simple, and I would focus your eyes on the main action, which is the keynote presentation. Now, the speaker for today is Rupert Howes, who is the CEO of the MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, where he has been CEO for 20 years. That's a long stint, a very impressively long stint. Before that, he worked in science policy, I think, both as an academic and as an organisation called Forum for the Future, which is a social change charity. Now, I could talk for Rupert's, history and distinguished kudos for a long time. But we have strict rules in these seminars, which is that the chair should jolly well shut up and get out of the way quickly, which is what I plan to do now. So over to you, Rupert.
Richard, thank you. We're just going to pull up our slides. I'd really like to thank Michael Magnelli, Lord Mayor of the City of London, and Zien for inviting MSC to be part of the Knowledge Mile lecture series. I am going to, very ambitiously, try to explain a little bit about the importance of fishing for humanity and give you some historical perspectives, the connection to London, the current state and pressures global fisheries are facing, and to give you an introduction to my organisation, the Marine Stewardship Council, and how we work with markets, including capital markets, the fishing industry and civil society to promote sustainable fishing. So all being well, the slides will work. And it's quite fascinating actually doing a little bit of research into this because I've never really looked at when humanity started fishing, and apparently our ancient ancestors, Homo habilis, 500,000 years ago were fishing. Modern humans appeared about 200,000 years ago, and the first evidence of humans using rods and fishing hooks was a carved bone from Japan that was about 40,000 years old. So fishing has been around as long as human beings have been around. This image is from the 13th century. This is a medieval image of shore-based fishing. And it's fascinating because seafood connects the world. It's food, it's trade, it's livelihoods, ocean health. And the Basque fishermen in the Middle Ages apparently had got to Newfoundland and the Canadian Grand Banks before Columbus did. And again, the Vikings would never have made their crossings from Norway to Iceland to Greenland and again to Newfoundland without fishing and their dependence on the cod stocks. By the late Victorian era, fishing was hugely important for food and employment. This image is from North Norfolk, with the herring being barreled by women who've come down, packers from Scotland. That's how important the industry was, following the fishing around the country and salt cod, salt herring in this case. In the UK, in London, bringing that connection back to London, Billingsgate Fish Market, which I'm sure everybody's heard about, received its first charter in 1400. And by the Victorian era, it was the biggest fish market in the world, which is quite incredible. Initially on Lower Thames Street, it's now moved to Canary Wharf in Poplar. Today, the fish market is a little bit more modest. It trades about 25,000 tonnes of seafood each year at a market value of about 1.2 million. And to put that into perspective, Tsukiji, the Japanese fish market in Tokyo, trades about 700,000 tonnes of fish each year at a value of about £6 billion. Interestingly, one of the first livery companies was Fishmongers, the worshipful company of fishmongers, which received its royal charter in 1272 by Edward I, set up to develop standards for and regulate fish trade in London. The current Fishmongers Hall at the north end of London Bridge is shown on the right. It was actually one of the first halls, not this one obviously, that burnt down in the Great Fire of London in 1666, one of the first of 54 livery companies that lost their halls. And so 700 years on, Fishmongers is still doing what it was set up to do in terms of regulation of fish trade and setting standards. Today, the global seafood industry is the last global industry harvesting a wild resource for food. It really is quite incredible. The most traded primary commodity in the world, 5 times the market of beef and more than tea, coffee, wheat, dairy combined. The problem is our love affair and demand for fish has resulted in significant increases in production. Since the 1970s, there's been a 5-fold increase in production. And now we have about 4.7 million fishing vessels around the world who, through technological development, have become more and more able at finding, hunting, and killing fish for consumption. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization produce a report every 2 years on the state of global fisheries. A new report's actually due out in a matter of days, but their last report, as you can see from this slide, shows that the overfish stocks have increased from around 10% in the 70s to about 35% today. Now, that picture isn't necessarily as bad as it looks because the percentage of landings from sustainably managed stocks has actually been going in the opposite direction, which is good. And I think total landings from sustainable stocks are about 82%. However, the demand for seafood, partly reflecting growing consumer interest in healthy, nutritious food, growing wealth and growing population, is set to double again by 2050, and in part due to expanding population. And I show this slide because it always amazes me. Modern humans, as I mentioned, have been around for 200,000 years. It took us 200,000 years to get to the first billion people in the early 1900s, in 1804. I was born in 1963 and the population was just over 3 billion. And in my relatively short lifespan, we've doubled, more than doubled, to 8 billion. And we're perhaps heading for a global population of 10 or 11 billion people. And humanity needs renewable sources of low carbon, nutritious food, hence the importance of seafood. Then you throw in the climate crisis and you can see why the oceans and fisheries are under such pressure. No time to really get into the nuts and bolts of this slide, but it's effectively showing how carbon dioxide emissions, parts per million, have been stable for tens of thousands of years. And then that dramatic uptake with the Industrial Revolution, taking us from 200 to 280 parts per million up to near 400 parts per million. This is leading to warming oceans, melting ice caps, increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events. Warming is leading to significant coral diebacks. I mean, this is a tragedy. We're currently experiencing the 4th mass dieback of tropical corals since 1998. And incredibly, the sea temperature off Florida last year was recorded at 38.4 degrees centigrade. Most people have a hot bath in 36 degrees. And all of this is having a profound impact on marine ecosystems, fishery health, reproductive health, and also migration patterns. So with part of the world on fire, part of the world underwater, growing demand, our ocean fisheries are under huge, huge pressure. My own organisation, the Marine Stewardship Council, was founded by WWF and Unilever. Unilever at the time were the world's largest purchaser of frozen white fish. Birdseye, Igloo, Gorton's in America were their brands, fish sticks, fish fingers in this country. And that fishery I mentioned, that the Basque fishermen were fishing off the Canadian Grand Banks, that fishery was Unilever's main source for frozen white fish. Overfishing led to the collapse of that fishery. 40,000 fishers lost their livelihoods. And I think that was the wake-up call for the industry to say, we need to ensure these stocks are managed sustainably. It's sort of enlightened self-interest. No Captain Birdseye, no profits in the absence of sustainably managed stocks. So the two organizations came together. We were founded in '97 to create a market-based program, something that could connect seafood producers through a credible evidence science-based certification and labeling program to consumers. What we're trying to do with our partners and civil society organizations that engage and support the organization is to contribute to creating a market that only wants sustainable seafood choices, ideally traceable back to the fisheries where the fish has been caught. I'm gabbling through this, and it's very disconcerting not being able to see anybody, only my slides. But this image really personifies what the MSc program is trying to do. We've been independent for the last quarter of a century, 25 years, and this is an image of the South African hake fishery, a fishery that came forward into the voluntary third-party assessment process. The certifiers determined that there wasn't one stock of hake, there were two. One was overfished, and in addition to that, over 10,000 seabirds were being killed annually, many of them are beautiful wandering albatross birds. The engagement with MSc led to a sort of a coming together of BirdLife International, WWF South Africa, the RSPB, the South African Deep Sea Trawlers Association, and the South African government, sort of using the MSc program and mechanism to work together to fix the problems. And fast forward, both stocks now managed sustainably. Simple improvements delivered in the way the nets were thrown and cast led to a 90% reduction in bird bycatch and a 99% reduction in wandering albatross bycatch. And the fishery is MSc certified, and I think it's about to be recertified for the third time. An independent economic analysis by the South African fishing industry indicated that in the absence of MSc, which opened up new export markets, preference in existing markets, and I think initially a price premium, the net present value of the fishery would be about 35% less. In addition, much needed processing jobs on shore, 12,000 processing jobs, many female workers on the onshore factories have been protected in part through their engagement with the MSc program. So very much a sort of a business case, an ecological case, good for the environment and good for consumers who will hopefully get sustainable seafood choices into the future. So 25 years of partnership, and I hasten to say MSc is just a tool. It really is down to the leadership and engagement of our partners, the fishing industry and the market, civil society engaging in the individual fishery assessments that delivers the outcomes in the ocean. But roughly where we are now is 20% of global fisheries in the world engaged in the program, over 2,000 documented fishery improvements recorded, and a market, this slide's already beginning to get out of date, approaching 15 billion. We're working in Asia, throughout Europe, North and South America. And interestingly, when people are given the right information, even if they won't pay more, they will certainly preference seafood products that have greater environmental credentials. Back to London. This is an image of the Thames Estuary cockle fishery, a 6,000-ton fishery that achieved its certification in 2019. And in fact, the UK team are very involved with both the UK market and the fishing industry, and we have about a quarter of the UK landings now in the programme. But the standard that we operate is open to all fisheries, no matter what scale, no matter what gear type, no matter what geography. So it applies to large-scale fishing vessels like this one in the Pacific Northwest in Alaska, the iconic Lofoten small boats in northern Norway. This image is quite incredible. It's a newly certified fishery in the Torres Straits. And this place is remote. I once, many years ago, in my early 20s, spent 3 months living on a boat diving in the Torres Straits. And this is a stretch of water between Cape York in northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. And this small island-based fishery was so determined to get MSc certification, and they've achieved it, which is quite remarkable. Little time to be able to really touch on this, but I did want to show this. I've talked about the profound challenge of climate change on the oceans and fisheries. And we've actually seen fisheries losing their MSC certifications now. Mackerel, hugely popular in Europe, Atlanto-Scandic herring, blue whiting. And this is because fish are moving to the poles. They're trying to move away from the warmer water to the cooler water. And in this case, this has resulted in the loss of nearly 3 million tons of certified fish supplies as nation states are failing to keep up with the critical need to manage fish stocks in an era of a global warming world. Turning to back to the city and finance, it's abundantly clear that we need finance to help fund the transition from an unsustainable economy onto a fundamentally more equitable and sustainable economy. I think a lot of people are aware of green finance, green bonds, green loans that have been funding more terrestrial types of investments or renewable energy, decarbonisation, carbon offsets, or whatever it might be. And it's fascinating to read that Zien's biannual, I think it's called the Green Capital Index, has indicated that London is actually the top centre in the world for green finance. And I think this runs into the trillions. But interestingly, blue finance, bonds, loans, financial flows to underpin and help investments in the ocean, be it on sustainable fisheries or on renewable energy, is very much in its infancy. I think it's currently only about 5 billion every year. So I think there's huge potential given London's leadership role in green finance and given our historic connections to the global seafood trade, and still, even if a relatively small economic sector, hugely important, I think, culturally for an island nation. A challenge to the city, if anybody's involved in this lecture today, to scale up the blue finance and help transition us to a much more sustainable blue economy. There's a lot of work going on with the UN on this. The UN FAO talk about a blue food transformation and the critical role food from the oceans can play. Already, fisheries supply about 20% of humanity's animal-derived protein needs. But for some people, maybe 3 billion people, it's one of the major sources of animal protein. And perhaps for 1 billion people on the planet, it is the only source of animally derived protein. So it's imperative that we ensure these stocks around the world, irrespective of MSC certification, fish sustainably, given the pressures that the oceans and fisheries are under. That's what MSC is trying to do with our partnerships. We've set an ambitious target of engaging over a third of fisheries by 2030 in the MSC program. And we very much link this to the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, SDG 14, Life Below the Water, which is all about ocean sustainability. So, into the future, we need to look after our food stocks for food security. There's evidence that sustainably managed fisheries are actually more resilient to ongoing climate change. They also play a part in carbon sequestration and food security and trade, hugely important. And we need every tool in the toolbox here. We need government policy to set an enabling environment to enable fisheries to be managed sustainably. We need civil society and advocacy groups to really raise awareness of the huge challenges and issues and the part all of us can play as consumers when it comes to the choices we make with the seafood if we choose seafood. Vital we ask where it's come from, is it sustainable? And we need the role of the market. And if anybody doubts the power of the market, this is my last slide. This is an image of a jolly Dutch scientist floating in the International Space Station. Planet Earth you can't quite see in the windows, through the windows behind him. But this is a can of MSC certified and labelled wild Alaskan salmon floating in zero gravity. And you can read the caption that he's put there. And imagine what that would cost in terms of product placement. And as I mentioned, MSC, through the leadership of our engaged partners, is now contributing to a market worth 15 billion nearly and growing. So despite the enormity of the challenges, I'm actually quietly optimistic that humanity can resolve the issues of overfishing and make inroads to ensuring our global fisheries are indeed fished sustainably. So I've probably gabbled through that so quickly, I'm finishing early, but I very much hope there's going to be some debate and dialogue and some questions. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Richard.
Thank you, Rupert. Yeah, that was very good to hear. And no chairman ever complains about anyone finishing on time, so that's very good. I have the privilege of a first question. One of the things that was running through my mind as you were talking was finance. You know, you think of the City of London as being a finance centre, and so I was thinking, well, what's the market in fish futures, and can they help with greening the industry? And then the other thing that came to mind was, is it possible? Obviously, the ships are insured, but can you insure a fishery? And should you be able to?
Oh, hang on, I've just lost you, Richard. There we go. Sorry, I momentarily lost you there. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. So my first question really was fish futures. What role do they have to play at all in greening the industry, or any role? And in fish insurance, can you insure a fishery? I mean, make sense to insure a fishery or not?
Well, this is interesting. With my limited financial knowledge, I shall try and answer that. What I can tell you is the first blue bonds are being issued. And in fact, a Norwegian bank, I think it's, I won't try and attempt to pronounce its Norwegian name, but it has issued a blue bond specifically linked to MSC certification. And if the companies applying for those bonds and that finance are MSC certified, they get access to a lower cost of capital. And the basis of that is the belief that if the stocks are managed sustainably, the future income derived from that fishery into the future should lower the risk of that loan and that finance not being repaid. In terms of insuring a fishery, I'm not too sure.
Just to interrupt, Rupert,
Yeah.
Andrew Russell actually asked, where would the funds from a blue bond be invested, and what would be the ORI and who pays? And did you just give the answer to that? Which was
I sort of did. I mean, there are many seafood companies, throughout the supply chain who seek funds to expand their businesses, and we are seeing the embryonic start of capital markets saying, actually, organizations like the MSC are very well established. We now have the metrics and the indicators of sustainability and well-managed sustainable fisheries from a third-party scientific process. We will use that information to inform us on who we will give preferential rates of capital to. We've had similar experience in Australia, where the Western Australian government put forward all of their fisheries into the MSC program, and I understand they've also got loans at about 0.5% cheaper than they would have in the absence of MSC.
Oh, I see. Right. And so it's a lower risk. Yeah, of course.
Lower risk and therefore lower cost of capital.
Sorry, yeah, I've been a bit silly today. Yes. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were talking about bonds, weren't you? And then insurance. Can you insure?
Well, you mentioned insurance, and I wasn't quite sure. I don't think I can answer that question. I haven't really got that one.
No. Well, there you go. We've started a new financial fisheries insurance. Great idea. Lydia Brown says, I know the talks about fisheries, but would you care to comment on how sustainable intensive aquaculture can ameliorate some of the overfishing problems that you cite? And maybe you could talk a little bit about seaweed as well while you're at it, because I know that's the topic.
Great questions. I mentioned the 5-fold increase in production of seafood. Now, a huge amount of that is coming from aquaculture. Wild capture fisheries have pretty much plateaued at about 80 million metric tons of seafood each year. If they were all managed sustainably, there is potential for that to expand, but the growth to really meet that doubling of demand in 2050 will come from aquaculture. The Marine Stewardship Council is focused on wild capture fisheries only, but we have a sister organisation called the Aqua Stewardship Council, and we're very closely aligned. It's a strong partnership. We operate their chain of custody and their logo licensing. And they were set up for the specific reason, just like wild capture fisheries, you need to differentiate best performers from perhaps those who aren't performing so well. So aquaculture has its challenges. And again, the market is preferencing certified, sustainable and traceable aquaculture products. On seaweed, interestingly, I was in South Korea a few weeks ago, we have developed a sustainable seaweed standard with the ASC, and it was fascinating to go down to Mokpo and go out and visit a seaweed farm where literally the seaweed is just settling on ropes. There's no enhancement, no feeding, and it's this highly nutritious protein source being produced. So I think it is a big part of the future.
And what about us citizens based in the UK? Will we soon be able to eat and delight in our own seaweed?
Yeah, I'm a novice to seaweed, and there's multiple species, different markets like different bits of seaweed. I think in Japan it's the nori that wraps up the sushi and you have on your plates of sashimi. In the UK we grow kelp, and kelp is highly nutritious. In the past it's been used as fertilizers on land. Pharmaceutical industry is particularly interested in seaweed as a source of micronutrients. So again, back to capital markets and finance, I hear interesting things are going on in investments in seaweed production.
Yeah. Well, we probably better skip gently over the suggestion from Hugh Purser that fish futures would obviously be considered blue chip investments, which, I mean, a joke like that has to be said, painful though it is. Now, Xu Fenhui asks, does the MSC engage with the giant fish factories sitting in international waters?
So MSC operates the world's most widely recognized certification and labeling program for environmental sustainability. We have a standard. It's applied by independent certification bodies. That's critical for credibility. We, as the standard holder, have no ability to say whether or not a fishery is certified. We cannot issue a certificate. We cannot remove a certificate. So we follow the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization rules on what constitutes a credible marine certification labeling program. And that means any fishery can come forward to be assessed. It's up to that unique fisheries circumstance and the evidence that will determine whether or not it achieves certification. So yes, we do have large-scale fisheries in the program. In Alaska, the pollock fishery is landing over 1 million tons of pollock every year. They have capture processor vessels of nearly 300 feet long. They're mini factories at sea. I think for some people, they might view that as an anathema of sustainable fishing, but in reality, they have the most sophisticated stock assessments. They have a very well-resourced Coast Guard. They have 2 observers on every boat. A percentage of the catch is shared with very remote native communities in Alaska, and they've been deemed to meet the MSC standard. And at the other end of the scale, you've got the Torres Straits lobster fishery. So we're open to all fisheries. It doesn't mean they'll pass. And each year, I should say, they have an annual surveillance audit to make sure they still meet the standard, and every 5 years they have to be recertified.
Interesting. I was very impressed with maybe I was wrong to be very impressed, but I was very impressed by this system developed by Serge Raymakers called Abelobi, which I'm sure you know about, which is a sort of tracking system for fish. And that's because I'm a computer scientist, so I enjoy technology. Do systems like that have a place in certification, do you think?
I'm not familiar with what you just mentioned.
Oh, it's a wonderful thing. So the idea is it's principally designed for South African fishermen. And what they do is they take a photograph of the fish they've caught as they catch it. And then at some point, it gets tagged with a QR code, I think, when it's landed. And then restaurants, who are the principal buyers of expensive fish like that, just log on and buy them online. So it's really an economic system. It's designed to cut out the middle person who is ramping the price, gouging. So it connects buyers with sellers, but of course it's also environmental because it gives you a very micro sort of track of where fish is being caught.
Absolutely. I mean, technology is developing all of the time, as we know. And what you've articulated, and you also used the word expensive, it absolutely has applications that are up and running now for some fisheries, particularly if they're hand-line individual fish and they've got short supply chains. That's great. But for MSC, we have a chain of custody, which is much more of a one-up, one-down traceability system from the restaurant or from the retailer back to the certified fishery. If you're landing 1 million tons of fish, you're not able to QR code and tag each individual fish. Although The
You might,
certifiers,
you might, you
sorry,
might be able to. You might be able to. I mean,
maybe, but that's one for the
yeah.
technicians to look at. But I was going to mention that where certifiers have viewed there's risks of illegal, unreported fishing taking place, they can bring in higher levels of requirements. So, for example, when the Chilean toothfish fishery, South Georgia toothfish fishery, first got certified in South Georgia in the South Atlantic, there was a lot of pirate fishing on what the Americans called Chilean sea bass. And so the chain of custody for MSC certification went right back to the individual vessel. And the rules that were applied were there could be no transshipment, vessels were inspected before they left port, when they came back. And each, I'm not sure if it was each fish, but each box of fish had an individual QR code based on a risk assessment.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, start sort of bottom-up approach. Now, Cynthia Adu asks, Cynthia from Packed Earth asks, she says, we make biomaterial textiles from ASC aquaculture collagen. Do you have any insights on the progress of multi-trophic aquaculture? So it's a rather technical question. I'm not sure I understand all the words in the question, but you might, Rupert.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I'm going to hide behind the fact that we're a wild capture program, and
Yeah.
by all means, we can pass it on to Chris Ninnis, the chief exec of the Aqua Stewardship Council, who worked for MSC for 10 years. So we'll have to make a note of that question and see if we can get an answer.
No worries. Christopher Messina asks, he says, how, if, do you interact with private seaborne riverine security initiatives paid for by private capital to protect public waterways in nations who cannot afford public sector Navy or Coast Guard? Now, there's a question that I didn't even know existed. So
We don't.
tell us.
We don't. MSC operates a global standard for environmentally responsible and sustainable fishing. The independent certifiers, when they assess each fishery, do have to take into account considerations of, well, they have to dig deep into the management and the data. We're a very data intensive program. And back to talking about illegal, unreported, unregulated or pirate fishing, if there are issues or lack of transparency in the fishery, if there's concerns about endangered, threatened, protected species interactions and lack of data or whatever it might be, the certifier will have to look at what sort of compliance mechanisms are out there. And if there are doubts, the fishery won't be certified. But as a global standard setter, we don't get involved in individual jurisdictions on some of those sort of issues to do with national management and particularly on security.
Yeah, I mean, you're an interesting organisation. You are, without the market, you don't. You enhance the market, don't you? Your organisation. You're not really a conventional regulator at all, I would say.
Well, on that, it's interesting. We were founded, as I mentioned, because of the collapse of the Grand Banks cod fishery. And in many ways, you could argue MSC was founded because of the failure of global governance to manage fish stocks. So, we're not a regulator. We don't have the power of a regulator, but we've set a standard that has become increasingly recognised around the globe as a recognised and trusted mark for sustainability. Interestingly, we are now engaging a little bit more in public policy as we've grown. The limits that we're now hitting is the failure of governments to set rules to manage stocks sustainably. So we're now doing a little bit of quiet public policy advocacy to encourage nation states to adopt quotas that accord to the science.
Yeah, it's a real success story, very interesting one. I think you need this label, you say to the consumer, and the consumer took a while, I think, to cotton on to that. But now I see, well, certainly in the country I live in, which is the United Kingdom, it's widely accepted, isn't it, that that's what you should have. I was going to ask you a little bit about penetration. I mean, there's a sort of the psychological aspect is you should only be eating fish that has got the logo on it. And in the UK, in the sort of middle class milieu that we all sit, that is widely accepted. But is it widely accepted across the world, do you think?
Very interesting question. I mean, when I started all those years ago, I can't believe 2 decades has flown by. MSC was a very small organization. We had 10 certified fisheries. We had maybe 200 labeled products. And we had one person in America, one person in Australia, and about 12 odd people in London. And there was a lot of skepticism that this notion of a certification and labelling program would work beyond Northern Europe, that had a sort of more of a receptivity to the sort of eco-labelling messages of fair trade, organics, or Forestry Stewardship Council. As we've grown, as we've engaged with the market, I would argue that there's resonance and receptivity to this message around the world. We're operating in China, we're operating in Japan, we're operating in a number of countries in Africa, we're operating in Indonesia, North and South America. And as I mentioned, if you give market players, the buyers who choice edit and decide what ends up in the cabinet in the retailer, and end consumers, they will preference sustainable choices. Now, MSC is one assurance mechanism. There are others. We're not a monopoly. But interestingly, we commissioned the biggest survey of seafood consumers in the world by GlobeScan, and they interviewed 25,000 seafood consumers in 16 markets, including many of the countries I've mentioned. And it's quite remarkable. We've been doing this for a number of years now, and consumers are deeply concerned about ocean health. Plastics has really drawn attention to the health of the oceans. They're aware of overfishing. They're concerned their children won't get to eat the fish that they've enjoyed, and they are very receptive to the MSC messaging. So I commend WWF and Unilever a quarter of a century ago of making this connection between markets and consumers through a certification labelling program, because we are continuing to grow despite COVID, despite high inflation and low margins in the industry.
Yeah, it's very impressive. I mean, the normal sort of NGO approach on this sort of thing would be to go and whinge at the local government that things needed to change. Yet you are making change, and presumably in areas where the government might not be very effective. You know, you're essentially bypassing it and relying on consumers and producers to make good choices, which they're very willing to do. That's my understanding of what you're doing.
Absolutely, because the more the market says we want sustainable seafood choices, that goes right back down the supply chain to the fishery. That's our theory of change. The more the market demand is there, the more fisheries come into the assessment process. Many have to make quite significant improvements on occasion to achieve certification and maintain it. And it's a virtuous circle of demand pull and supply push. And on the regulatory side, the fishing industry and the market also get involved in public policy engagement. One of the biggest challenges for fisheries is something called harvest control rules and harvest strategies in the high seas, the regional fisheries management organizations, where you have coastal nations and fishing nations all contributing to the setting of the rules. And these organizations operate quite slowly. But I think we're getting a conflux of market, industry, civil society, all beginning to say these are the sorts of rules that we actually need. It's one reason why I'm optimistic. We need to accelerate a bit, but change is happening.
Mm. And Rupert, maybe this is not within your purview again, but I was just finished reading this very interesting book about the Shetland fishing industry by a chap called John Goodlad, called The Salt Roads, which I was put in mind of your beautiful photograph of North Norfolk. And what is evident in that is how freaking dangerous fishing was. And it's still dangerous. I think it's still in the UK the most dangerous profession in the UK. And therefore, I'm assuming it's dangerous in most of the world. Is it sustainable to have a profession that is so dangerous? And if it's not sustainable, does it form any part of your assessment of sustainability?
Richard, that's a great question with a huge amount wrapped into it. John Goodlad I know very well. I've been up to the Shetlands and visited him there and been out.
His book was a wonderful read, so I enjoyed it very much.
It's absolutely brilliant. Okay, yes, I mean globally, the fishing industry I think is about the most dangerous industry. I think it's higher than mining. Agriculture is second. Unfortunately, farmers flipping tractors and injuries. So it is a dangerous profession. All professions carry their risks. Obviously, there's a whole national legislation of health and safety and maritime rules that the industry have to follow. But tragically, when fishing vessels go down, they can go down very quickly. And if you have crew operating below deck, it's deeply challenging. I don't have all of the stats on that. I know safety records are improving considerably from where they were. But it doesn't form part of our standard. And this is a significant question you've actually asked. We are focused on ecological sustainability. That is
Yeah.
hard enough to look at the stock, the wider environmental impacts, the quality of the management regime. We don't look at carbon. We don't look at the welfare of the fish. We don't look at the social dimension. These are all hugely important. I don't dismiss them, but we already operate perhaps the most costly, complex standard. And to add all of this as well might make the program less attractive to drive our core mission, because there are many easy exit ramps of weaker levels of assurance with no assurance, no action plans for improvement. So it's a complex one, and I know we're beginning to run out of time. So it's an
Yeah,
immediate.
I'm not. It's not a criticism. I was sort of really a genuine question: the extent to which other things could and should be folded in to
Yeah.
your mission, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to say no. I mean, they have a narrow mission that everyone understands. Hugh Purser has very kindly copied into the Q&A a link to an article by Benjamin Thompson on blue bonds for marine conservation and sustainable ocean economy, which perhaps I should just, while we're talking, I will just pop that in the chat so other people can access it.
Thank you. I'll look forward to looking at that.
Which I'll just do now. Yeah, good. Right, time is going to press upon us, isn't it? What else did I want to ask you? Oh yeah, okay. Final question. Right. Greenwashing, right? So greenwashing is everywhere, isn't it? People are always making false claims for this and that. To what extent is that going on in the fishing industry, do you think? And to what extent can the MSC counter it?
Again, great question, very, very topical. In part, what MSC tried to do right from the beginning was to bring some transparency into the seafood supply chain all the way back to the fishery. The idea is that when you see that blue eco label and that fish tick, it's your assurance very quickly that there's been an independent third-party process to make sure that is a fish that's come from a certified sustainable supply. The greenwashing, and there's the EU Green Deal, the Green Claims Directive coming out. In the US, the Federal Trade Commission are looking at greenwashing and claims. And I think they're very concerned about sort of weak schemes, claims that just say, natural, sustainable, environmentally friendly without any backing. And so in many ways, the pending legislation, I think, is actually going to be very helpful for programs like the Marine Stewardship Council, across all sorts of different commodities, if it's evidence-based third-party certification. And interestingly, at the Barcelona Seafood Show, which is one of the biggest gatherings in the world, about 30,000 people from the seafood industry descend into Barcelona. And we had Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius, the outgoing head of DG Mare, talking about green claims. And he specifically was saying certification is what's needed to underpin a green claim. So we feel that actually this will add to the value proposition of MSC certification in the marketplace.
Right, Rupert, so interesting. Could have talked for another 20 minutes, really, couldn't we? But we've got to stop. So just a quick look at what's coming up, folks. Here is a list of some interesting lectures on the way in this series, which we're enjoying very much. And some thank yous. First, thank you to the audience, of course. Thank you for your interest and engagement, which is always welcome, particularly if you're a chair, because otherwise you have to think of all the questions, which I didn't have to do in this case. Good. And secondly, thank you to Rupert at the MSC. I know it's a hassle to put these talks together, but it's really nice to see them. If you missed it or you want to come back to it, then this lecture and all our lectures are recorded. They're available and posted on our YouTube channel. Do pop in there to have a look at stuff. If you've enjoyed this, then I should also say you might enjoy the lectures of Gresham College, which is a free lecture resource from the City of London, almost near neighbours of the MSC, actually, in Holborn. And thank you to Zien, who provide all of the technical expertise to run these lectures. Other than that, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.